Thank you for joining us today for the breakout section titled Beyond the UN Security Council, Regional Institution as Peace Builder. Like we've heard since yesterday when we joined the Cape Town conversation, armed conflict worldwide are at the highest level since the end of the Cold War. We've heard example on the African continent. We have the case in Sudan, in the DRC, but also in the Sahel region. We also look at the situation in Palestine, in Ukraine. While this conflict continue with devastating effect, we see that global, continental, regional, but also even national conflict resolution mechanisms are failing or are struggling to respond efficiently. The absence of credible mediator often allow conflict to last longer with devastating effect. And this is a moment for fresh thinking. And to do that, we are joined here by Kayode Fayemi, visiting professor at the African Leadership Center, and Julia Rocknin-Fad, senior lecturer, School of Law and Governance, Faculty of Business and Law. So I want to start by delving directly into the question. A regional institution, and Kayode, please, you can tell us about the African Union experience, ECOWAS that you know very well. And Julia, if you can delve in the specific case of ASEAN. Are they better placed to manage conflict as global governance mechanisms are losing legitimacy, but also their credibility even being called into question?
Well, if we treat the question historically, in the immediate aftermath of the post-Cold War era, it became inevitable for regional institutions to play more active roles because as the bigger powers began to retreat from boots on ground in situations of peacekeeping and peacemaking, a lot of regional institutions stepped into the fray because the UN, as the global governance framework, also depended largely on many of the countries in the global south in their peacekeeping operations. So if you take the example, immediate aftermath of Somalia, with the negative experience that the United States had in Somalia, African conflicts that emerged in the immediate aftermath of the post-Cold War era, say Liberia or Sierra Leone, African countries were confronted with the inevitability of dealing with the issues themselves because Western powers refused to put boots on ground to address those issues. So the regional hegemons, the big countries in the continent, Nigeria, in the case of West Africa, South Africa, in the case of DRC and Rwanda, stepped into the plate, organized their sub-regions, and then stepped into the conflict and managed to play a very significant role, which then led to the development of norms and standards on conflict mechanisms, resolutions framework. In West Africa, that was when we got the ECOWAS conflict prevention mechanism in place. And that has since been used in subsequent conflicts beyond Sierra Leone and Liberia, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Guinea-Bissau, in Gambia. However, we're talking 30 years ago. Now we have found ourselves in an awkward situation in which even regional institutions are finding it difficult to intervene and act. They understand the concept of collective security mechanism. They understand the need to also weigh in on the part of external players to act in unison, and they push for that. The African peace and security architecture that emerged from that process that I just described no longer functions as effectively as it ought to. So in Sudan, and even in DRC, Eastern DRC now, and in Ethiopia, those are the most recent conflicts that we've had to deal with. The African Union has been largely absent. And the mediatory mechanism for these conflicts found itself outside of Africa, in Qatar, for example, where DRC and Rwanda have been engaging with the Qatari mediators and other external players, and African Union became an observer in that. There's no way that you can shave a person's head in its absence. And that is why, as we run into challenges with the global governance framework of the UN, you have to find a way to resolve the conflicts as closest to the problem as possible.
We'll come back to that now. Some of the challenges that
then address that and make it effective that we need to focus on.
Thank you so much, Julia. When you look at the situation in the Middle East, a regional organization better placed to deal with conflict in that region, and you see, if you draw comparison with what has already been said with the African continent, are they the same challenges facing those regional organizations?
Well, if we look at the situation in the Middle East, I would still argue that regional organizations would be better positioned to deal with the crisis. But the question is, what kind of regional organizations we are talking about? Is it Gulf Cooperation Council? Is it some of the proposed but not existing yet frameworks for security, upholding security in the region, and those that ideally should be including the non-Arab states in the region, especially Iran and Turkey? And I would say in the Middle East, that kind of structure and that kind of political will is absent at the moment. And this is why we are facing with such a terrible situation that we've been discussing since yesterday evening. I would say there are regional organizations that showed a better potential at this point, like ASEAN, for example, which managed to tackle the crisis that arose this year between Thailand and Cambodia. And the ceasefire, it's not a peace deal, a kind of a peace agreement, which was more about the ceasefire, not addressing the core problem that Thailand and Cambodia have. But nevertheless, Malaysia, as a secretary, as a chairman of ASEAN this year, managed to foster this peace, even though President Trump came to ASEAN summit to claim credit for that. And indeed, there was some pressure rendered by the United States on the regional players with his desire to impose tariffs. So they kind of had to yield to the United States with this peace agreement in order to get a better deal for themselves vis-a-vis tariffs. So it's a kind of a bulk deal that they got. But then what came out of it? We saw it unraveling recently. So that ceasefire did not hold for long enough because the core issue was not addressed, and also probably because it was fostered from the outside, or rather they came to it under pressure. So that speaks in favor of that regional structures need to put more effort, and they actually will have to deal with the fallout right now with, I think, the United States not so much willing to get engaged. I think regional, addressing the peace resolution of the existing conflicts regionally, it makes a lot of sense right now. And if we can apply the analogy of the multi-level government or multi-level governance at the global scale, then it only makes sense to address these issues regionally because they are in better touch with forces on the ground. They have better understanding and they have interests vested in it, unlike the foreign parties whose interests might differ. So on the one hand, they understand it better. On another hand, resolving it regionally without outside pressures would keep them insulated in preservation from the external interference and preservation of their local interests, of the regional interests. And I think if I may produce here just one example, I think ASEAN also showed themselves pretty well in addressing the Russia-Ukraine developments, where almost all regional actors refused to take a stand on the issue, except for probably Singapore. And Singapore well secured itself a better deal as well on Trump's tariffs. But that was not a concerted effort where each country actually acted more or less independently on this, but they had this right sense that we should stay out of it because otherwise our interests might be affected.
Thank you so much. Like you said, regional organizations understand the issue better. They are close to the conflict and they have vested interests beyond political will, beyond external actors meddling in regional conflict. What are some of the challenges that make regional organizations often inefficient in resolving some of this conflict in which they also have vested interests in terms of peace and security? What are some of those challenges? You started mentioning some of them.
Well, it seems to me that if we look at this broadly, regional organizations are sometimes not well equipped.
The issue of resources.
The issue of resources is there. Two, they don't also have permanent structures. In Africa, for example, we've been talking about the African Peace Command since the 60s. The ECOWAS standby force since the 90s. None of this has actually been put in place. That's one.
So implementation as well.
It is a challenge, but there is a broader challenge, which is when you look at many of the conflicts we're talking about, you need guarantors that are respected. So
and do we have some of them?
Region, if it's going to work, I mean, we often poo-poo the idea of hegemonic powers. But if regional institutions are to be effective in intervening, our experience in Africa is that you need at least in each region one hegemon that can enforce whatever principles and values have been collectively agreed by all the countries in the region. And that's the role that Nigeria has largely played in the ECOWAS sub-region. It's the role that South Africa tried to play in the southern African sub-region. The challenge, of course, with that is that if the structural drivers of conflict and instability have not been addressed effectively by that regional hegemon itself, it undermines its moral suasion. It undermines its standing with the remaining players that, okay, the person we're supposed to look up to has not demonstrated leadership capacity, has not demonstrated the core values of addressing what is responsible for instability, poverty, inequality, that are usually at the root of many of the other conflicts that we see in our, at least in our continent, whether it is ethnic differences, religious extremism, constitutional. And in Africa, for example, we have standards. We said we would not accept any unconstitutional change of government. That's a principle adhered to. I mean, we were having a conversation. Samir told us yesterday that the conversations that are going on now are usually conversations of power. And conversations of purpose without conversations of principles. And where we've got a pretty robust set of principles on the African continent post-Cold War, with the formation of the African Union, or the transition from the Organization of African Unity to African Union. But how have we managed to fare with those principles on constitutional change of government? And now we have the Sahelian states, in the case of ECOWAS. And the African Union. And when ECOWAS wielded the big stick and said, okay, this is in total conflict with the principles that we have all agreed to, the protocol on democracy and good governance that you all signed up to as countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, you all signed that you are part of this process. Now, you've changed your government unconstitutionally, you are suspended. What emanated from that? Exit from ECOWAS. Backed by external players that are supposed to be used as leverage for protecting those core values. So we're back to the conversations of power, not right from the conversations of principle.
And we need to focus on principle, looking at the Middle East, what are some of the challenges beyond the one you already mentioned? What are some of the challenges that regional organizations are facing in that context?
I think that speaking of the Middle East, it's exactly the conversation of the absence of principles, at least principles that would be common for everybody, that states would follow, and that we would see some kind of mobilization and coordination of effort regionally by GCC, by the Arab League, by the OIC, for example, and others who are ready to support them, including from us in Southeast Asia, in the so-called global South, who would like to contribute. Indeed, there are even some Southeast Asian countries contributing to the peacekeeping force in Gaza, proposing like Indonesia, and actively participating in the talks in the summit that President Trump convened in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt recently on this. So that lack of mobilization and coordination, the principle-based, is absent despite the war in Gaza ongoing for over 2 years already. If we shift to, I wanted to shift a little bit to ASEAN as well, to echo what Kayode just said about the absence of permanent structures. For example, for us in ASEAN, the organization that was founded in 1967, it was suitable for the moment as a peacekeeping mechanism with this soft tactics, the consensus building, mechanisms of conflict resolution. But now, obviously, it is not working. And
what is needed? What is needed to make it work? Do we need reform?
Yes. We do need a reform, and it does not only concern the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council, but also structures like ASEAN, where there are more of rising voices supporting a more meaningful policy security mechanism of conflict resolution, the one that probably would do away with the principle of non-interference for very critical cases that, for example, like we have now in Myanmar, there is a war ongoing, but now it's out of headlines, but it doesn't mean it is not happening. The immigration crisis, the refugee crisis that ASEAN countries are also facing. So something needs to be done to also prevent the tarnishing of the
Who
image.
Should do it? Who should do it? Who should do that something?
Well, I think the world should do it because it's the world, but the countries closest to the problem should take the lead.
What about population?
If you look at what happened, let's take Libya. Libya, when African heads of states were trying to restrain America from invading Libya.
That's what the French.
Of course, in the French. It was inevitable. They were told that they can't even go there.
So the country
wanted to. So
they should lead the process.
They should lead the process because they are more sensitive to the issues. Yes, some of them may be compromised either in backroom deals with if it's a case of dictatorship or authoritarian rule that they're trying to protect the human rights of the citizens, but if there are principles already agreed, and in many cases there are a plethora of principles. The African Union has tons of principles and processes, but they should be interested in focusing more on the outcomes than the process, because what tends to happen is that we get so consumed by the focus on process that we ignore.
Lose out on the outcome. What is the role, maybe to close the section, what is the role of citizen in all this process? Because we've seen in part of the world, citizens taken to the street to demand reform. We saw it in West Africa. We saw it in Madagascar not long ago. We saw it also when it came to Palestine, the issue of Palestine across the globe. What is the role of citizen? And if you can maybe make your closing remark when addressing this question.
Well, frankly, I think the world that we're living in, and Africa exemplifies it probably more than others. I mean, we have a very youthful continent. And young people, as you know, they don't have the patience to tolerate these long, drawn processes that don't produce results, tangible results in jobs, in a better life, and in democratic development. So we need to get the citizens better organized. That's the first thing, because you can have frustrations that are not channeled in the proper way to get you the result that you need, because you need to understand that power resides with the people, but only if the people push for power to reside in them. And that's when the power players would respond, because they know, we all say, we can speak through to power. Power knows the truth, but it's convenient for power to ignore the truth unless it is forced to respond to the yearnings of the citizens. And I think for me, if Africa, for example, or the same applies to Asia, wants to have a seat at the table, the best way to have a seat at the table is to respond to the yearnings of your citizens back home. When your citizens are with you, it's easier to insist that I won't be on the menu of the new scramble. I would be at the table as co-rule makers.
Make sure your citizens are with you and you respond to their need. Julia?
Yeah, I do echo that sentiment, what Coyote just mentioned. And that would be fair to say for Asia, East and West, for the Middle East and Southeast Asia in particular. I would say maybe for Northeast Asia, not so much. But I believe that even in authoritarian contexts, people have a lot of power. And even authoritarian leaders and governments, they try to measure their policies based on what the people want. It's just at home, they moderate these expectations. They try to shape those expectations of what people eventually demand, but they respond to them. And with a kind of awakening or emancipation of people that we've been observing lately, I do believe that people hold a lot of that power, both in the Middle East, in the Arab nations who are better off than, well, Palestine, obviously, at the moment, and in Southeast Asia, where threshold for people rising up and protesting against something is much higher. So people need to be really angry, really irritated. But that has a lot of influence. Why? Because those governments, they tend to shape their formulate their foreign policies based on domestic factors in the first turn, not based on regional considerations. So they are going to be looking at home first and then formulating their foreign policies based on that. So yes, I would say people hold a lot of power.
Thank you so much. So regional organizations are necessary.
Absolutely.
They understand the issue better. They're closer to the situation, but this process needs to be bottom up. Yeah. And citizen has a very important role, and government need to respond to governance challenges if we want reform to happen at all levels, continental, but also at the global level.
It's concentric, actually. Domestic level, sub-regional,
yeah, continental,
and then global. We're
level.
Not saying that ignore the UN. Let us reform the UN in the process of change, but bring it closer to those who are more accountable.
And this needs to be based on principle. Yeah. Thank you so much, Coyote. Thank you, Julia, for joining us.
Thank you for having us.